Have you ever witnessed a fantasy football punishment? Well, to explain, last year in my football league, one of my friends had to wear a dress around in public all day. Fantasy football is a competition between friends or foes in order to create the ultimate goal of winning your league and even winning some money. In 1967, fantasy football was founded by Bill Winkenbach so that he could not witness the tragedy of the Oakland Raiders at the time. Ever since then, fantasy football has grown exponentially. Today, fantasy football serves as an online competition between fans in order to create the ultimate ideal football team, customized to their preference. Today, I want to introduce to you three important aspects of fantasy football. First off, I will be talking about the betting side of fantasy football. In a quote by the Fantasy Sports and Gaming Association, on average, sports players spent $653 on league-related costs, single-player challenge games, and league-related materials over a 12-month period. Most of fantasy football's competitiveness comes from the motivation to win money. In a study by Nikki Lewis, he explains, an exploratory factor analysis determined 5 distinctive motivations for participation: desire to win, social identification, sport involvement, appearance, and most importantly, financial gain. Usually for fantasy leagues, there's a buy-in. So players put in money before they play, and then whoever wins the league at the end of the year gets all that money put in. Another really important betting side of fantasy is the pay-to-play single-player challenge games that are on websites like DraftKings or FanDuel. In order to succeed in betting during fantasy football, you need to know the guidelines. The goal of fantasy football is to collect the most productive players that will give you the most points over time. At the start of the fantasy season, there's a draft where these managers pick their team that is made up of a quarterback, running back, wide receivers, tight end, and even a kicker. Fantasy points are given to a player when they either gain yards or they score a touchdown. Also, there are several different types of fantasy leagues. For example, there are PPR leagues, which stand for points per reception. There are standard leagues, and there's even dynasty leagues, where players keep their players from year to year, and all of these different leagues need some different strategy. So, moving on to strategy. Strategy in fantasy football is very complex. A good way to explain it is through this quote by ESPN. The real task is digesting all of these different angles and resources and forming your own strategy for not only the upcoming season, but throughout your days playing fantasy football. Most of the strategy in fantasy football is drafting the players that you think will get you the most points every single week. For example, a manager usually drafts in the first round a running back due to the amount that they're the most consistent position at getting you the most fantasy points. Strategy is so complicated due to the fact that no one really knows how the players will perform. However, we can estimate that players can do okay through what they've done in the past. For example, in an article about the analytical approach to fantasy football, Adrian Becker and Zoo Andy Sun explain this program that they made to figure out who would be the best players at fantasy. But even this program can't effectively predict what will actually happen. In conclusion, fantasy football is an online competition with multiple different aspects like the betting side, its strategy, and the rules. Since the 2000s, fantasy football has blown up in so many ways, and even more Americans are starting to become a part of it. For example, fantasy sports were played by more than 59 million people in America and Canada in 2017. So, who wants to play?